We are in week 2 of our study of Ruth. It is 4 chapters long, so we are going to read Ruth chapter 2 this morning. It's in the Old Testament section of your Bible on page 242 if you'd like to follow along. This is Ruth chapter 2. And it says this: Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And just as Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. And Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field, and she has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Do not go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. And she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in the eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." And so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. And she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. And Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. And her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." And then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. It's the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So if you were here last week, or even if you weren't here last week, let's go over what happened last week. Last week, Naomi and her husband took their sons and moved to Moab because there was a famine, and everything went good until it didn't. And then all the men started dying one at a time, and Naomi was left with her 2 daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, and she begged them to just go back. Right? Naomi is very bitter. She said, "The Lord has turned against me. I'm going home. You ought to go home as well." And Ruth refused to leave her. Ruth clung to her and followed her back to Israel, back to around Bethlehem, which was where Naomi was from. And her daughter-in-law was now, she said, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. But Ruth is a Moabite, and the Moabites are not well respected or well liked in Israel. They're the enemy. But she's a Moabite woman, a foreigner in the land. And then we get to today. And to get to today, you have to understand a little bit about what's going on here. And to do that, we have to go back to Leviticus chapter 23. I'm going to take you there real quick. Just one quick little verse here. In amongst the teaching on the festivals that the Israelites are supposed to celebrate every year, there's this little verse that just kind of gets thrown in there in the time of Moses, okay? And this is what it says. This is Leviticus 23:22. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord, your God. And so that's what's going on when Ruth sees a field and decides she's going to go in there and follow the harvesters and see if she can gather some grain. It's kind of like, when you mow the lawn and you go around the corner and you're not really paying attention and there's like that little strip around the corner that you miss, right? So what is in the law that God says is if you go around the corner and miss that little bit, don't go back and knock it down and harvest it. All right, you got to leave it up. You ever been to a cornfield, especially back in the olden days? Now with all the hybrid corns and stuff, it's not quite the same. But you look at a cornfield and like it's all this high, beautiful corn, except those outside rows, they're kind of gnarly. The corn stalks are a little, they're a little shorter and they're not quite as good. So what he's saying is when you cut down the corn, just leave that gnarly row standing up. Don't go all the way to the edges. If something falls off or falls out of your basket when you're walking along, you just kind of have to leave it on the ground. That's the rule of God, and the idea is simply, there's got to be stuff left for the poor and the outsiders among us. That's the rule of God. But the deal with a rule like that is that people don't always follow the rules, right? The big fear of Ruth is that she's going to get into a field and she's going to be dealt harshly with. We're not leaving that outside row standing because we're not going to go back and get it. Just because it fell out of the basket doesn't mean you can pick it up. You're a foreign woman out in the fields and you don't belong here and we don't want you here. Like that's the way it could work, right? And it's just not in that time, it's all time. There are rules, especially in this book, that we don't like to follow. Am I right? I mean that whole if you get hit on the cheek, turn the other cheek thing, I don't want to do that. Right? Love your enemy and pray for the people who persecute you. I'm not a fan of that one either. There's a lot of rules like that I'd prefer not to follow. And there were a lot of people who didn't follow this particular rule that made Naomi worry about Ruth, Ruth worry about herself. And ultimately, we'll see Boaz kind of worry about Ruth, right? But listen, these gleaners... you look at it and it's like, well, I can see if the gleaners were happening today, there'd be some of us who would be like, well, I'm not going to leave that standing because those gleaners are just gleaning that grain and they're going to use it to buy drugs. Right? That gleaner's just a scam artist. She drove here in a Mercedes. Right? That's what we think when we're out in the world and we see people who are asking for money or who are doing things, who are poor, who are broken. We've got this idea in our head that they're scammers, and back then they would have thought the same. Especially if you're the landowner, it's like, well, this is my grain. Why do I want these people to come in and take this grain? But there's all this built in. But the cool thing is that Naomi knows Boaz, but they don't necessarily know the field that Ruth is going into belongs to Boaz. But that's whose field Ruth ends up in. And Ruth asks to go out to glean, and she's probably a little naive, like a new Christian, when we think, oh, now I know Jesus, and I'm going to go to this church, and everything's going to be perfect, and we're going to love each other, and we're going to change the world. And then you get into the church, and you realize we're just a bunch of sinners trying to find our way through life, right, and working together at it. It's not everything it's cracked up to be all the time, and she's maybe a little naive, got big eyes. Look, the law says I can go in and glean in this field, but it may not turn out well, but it does. It does, and the reason it does is because of the word I put in the bulletin today, is because of devotion. Ruth, first and foremost, is devoted to Naomi. And this is a continuation of last week. And more than following her into a foreign land, today what Ruth does is she puts herself to work, right? She goes the extra mile. She starts early. She gives her whole self for Naomi, that they might eat and have something. This is missions. This is generosity, and it's being shown to us by the foreigner in our story, the Moabite girl. But it's not just devotion by Ruth to Naomi, but the workers in the field, right? Boaz isn't there when this story starts, but these workers in this field show themselves to be devoted to God's law. And I don't know if that's because they've worked for Boaz and that's how he is, or if it's just because they're good people, but they are. They know the law. They inquire who she is, because when Boaz asks, they tell him who she is, right? Well, she's the Moabite girl who came back with Naomi, and now she's out there and she's gleaning, right? They allow her to glean, and they even offer her at one point. It's kind of in there, and you miss it if you're just reading along. They give her a place to rest. They go, well, she's been here all day, and she's been working, and the only time she took a little bit of time was when she went over and she rested in our shelter. So they even give her a little spot to rest. Okay? Both Ruth and these workers are going the extra mile for someone. Ruth is going the extra mile for Naomi. The workers are going the extra mile for Ruth, which makes me wonder how often I fail to take the extra steps and go the extra mile. It's what I was talking to Mariah about today, when something in my head reminds me that there's a step that I should take, and I'm just like, I don't want to do that, right? You should really call your sister. I don't want to talk to my sister. Right? I don't want to do that today. Well, man, you should buy a few extra jars of gravy. I don't have the money to buy the extra gravy. Right? God whispering in my ear, and me not deciding I'm not going to take those extra steps. How this story turns out if people don't take the extra steps. But they're all taking it, because the workers are devoted to God's law, and Ruth is devoted to Naomi. And Boaz rewards devotion. Not only that, but he confirms his employees' devotion. But he rewards the devotion. It's interesting. He asks, well, who is that? And they tell him who Ruth is, and when he talks to Ruth, he knows even more than they tell him. So Boaz is doing his homework, just like his workers did their homework, and he shows up, and we get to this great little section of Scripture, verses 11 and 12, where Boaz does a couple things. First of all, he makes a statement about Ruth's character. He says, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father, your mother, your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know. He says, I've heard about you. I know what you've done. But then he does something that's really cool. He offers her his blessing. So Boaz offers Ruth his blessing. I think we've lost the art of the blessing in our church. Not just this church, in the church, right? What Boaz does is he's done his homework. He sees the best in one of the least of the people of Israel. And he offers this blessing. He says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He shows his devotion to God, his devotion to family. He shows his devotion to a poor immigrant in his field by offering her that blessing of refuge under God's wings. Refuge that is provided by God. And it's interesting because God will provide refuge in difficult times. But God provides refuge to us in a million ways. I mean, just strictly the country we were born in, the families we've had, the spouses, the kids, the schools we've been able to attend, the friendships that we have made. These are all God's blessings. These are things provided by God for our benefit. And sometimes I wonder how I worry, I guess. I don't wonder. I worry that I don't stop and consider all that I've been truly given. And I don't take the time I should take to say thanks to God. That refuge that was provided to Ruth was provided by God, but it was also provided by Ruth. Because Ruth did her job. She played a role in her own prosperity. We all play a role in our own prosperity as well as providing for others. And this isn't about money. I'm not going to be a prosperity preacher and preach about money. It's more about playing a role in the work of God in our own lives so that we can share that grace of God to other people. It's a statement about the time that we give God. The wisdom that we work to receive, the grace that we can pass along to others when we fully know God. And it makes me wonder if I'm giving my best to God, if I'm giving the best parts of my day to God, to understanding Him better and to sharing Him with others, or if I'm just lazy. The refuge of God is also provided in this story by Boaz, because the community plays a role in providing refuge for others as well. We do it in dozens of ways, right? I mean, Thanksgiving baskets and free meals and hospitality and a place for people to meet. We provide for people in dozens of ways, but when the community provides just comfort and care and strength in difficult times, that's often when it becomes most clear to us the value of the people around us. When I was younger, I always used to say, when it comes to friends, that old saying, it's better to have 4 quarters than 100 pennies, right? It's better to have 4 good friends than just 100 acquaintances floating around out there. I used to believe that until I was in the worst time of my life, having suffered the death of someone I loved very dearly. I was broken, I was sad, I was depressed, and I remember I was at the viewing leading up to the funeral, and standing in line, just I'm sure slumped over. And I remember this guy from my high school showed up to the viewing. And it was a guy who was a year behind me in school, who I don't know if I'd ever had more than 3 conversations with in my life, but he'd seen on Facebook what was going on, and he showed up, and he walked through, and he shook my hand, and I was like, "Mark Gregory, what are you doing here?" And he said these words. He said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to be here." And that was the moment I realized that sometimes it's better to have 100 pennies than 4 quarters. Sometimes you need 4 good friends, and sometimes you need lots and lots of people to hold you up. Right? Don't underestimate the effect you can have as a member of a greater community on someone who you maybe don't even know. but who you reach out to in love, because God provides refuge under his wings through the acts of the community. See, this chapter 2, it's about being thankful for things that sometimes don't even seem like blessings. It's about having the character to follow through on things even when it's hard or questionable. It's about simply doing our best sometimes. You know, they get to that point where it's like, oh, and she threshed her barley and gathered it, and it amounted to about an ephah. And to us, that's like, man, ephah is kind of like a gigawatt. Like, it means nothing. It's a unit of measure that I don't know what it means, right? So, right? It's so what needed fixing? The Canuter valve. Well, it's meaningless. It means nothing to me. She gathered an ephah. What's an ephah? So I go down. You have to go down to the fine print at the bottom of the Bible to figure out the weights and measures. It's about 30 pounds. All right, that's good. 30 pounds of barley. Or if you're from anywhere else in the world, 13 kilograms, okay? But we're Americans, we like pounds. 30 pounds, and I read somewhere that that's about a year's worth of grain. Yeah, that's pretty good. She gathered about a year's worth of grain, and she hasn't even gone to the extra fields that he's invited her into yet. So that's about a year's worth of grain for her and Naomi, and with more fields and with different grains to harvest, what Boaz is offering them is not only food for their table, but a source of income for the rest of the year that they can trade for other things and they can sell. Boaz is becoming their benefactor, but he's becoming more than that. We get this little glimpse forward. I'm almost done here. We get this little glimpse forward in verse 20 when Naomi just kind of mentions in passing, he's not only our close relative, he's one of our guardian redeemers. That's a little nugget that's going to point us forward to Ruth chapter 3 and 4. Because Ruth is ultimately going to become for us a parable about redemption. But for this week, I just want you to focus on a couple things, all right? I want you to focus on taking the extra step, the extra prayer, reading the extra psalm, buying an extra jar of gravy, calling a friend. And I want you to be thankful for the shelter and the blessing you've received under the wings of God. Look intentionally for the blessings of God, the blessings of a friend, the blessings that you find in your church, and give thanks. May you see the blessing of God in your life, the small gifts, the large gifts, and may you overflow with thanks.